Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This project has received funding from the European Union and Carleton University. The views expressed in this video do not reflect those of the European Union or the Center for European Studies. Hi, I'm Merrick Eby with the Center for European Studies at Carleton University, and I'm joined today by Dr. Richard Bellamy from the European University Institute in Florence. Dr. Bellamy is at Carleton this weekend at a conference regarding the Eurozone crisis and its impacts on democracy. So thank you for joining me today, Dr. Bellamy. Well, in the current crisis, we've really seen new tools and new governance modes emerge in the European Union, things like the Fiscal Stability Pact. So in broad terms, I'm wondering, how has the crisis and the response of the EU affected relations between the European level and the member state level, and what are some of the implications for democracy in the EU based on that relationship?
I think one of the interesting features of this is it's shown that despite all the talk of how interconnected we are and how globalized we are, which of course in some respects is true, that's why this crisis has occurred, nonetheless many of our principal institutions, not least finance institutions, which many people think of as being the most globalized, even within a currency union, are national. And the prime responsibility for bailing out these institutions falls on particular governments and states. So as a result, even within a currency union, such as EMU, it was the member state governments that had to take the burden and reach the agreement between the executives of those governments and then with the European Central Bank. It wasn't something which went through supranational democratic channels. The European Parliament simply hasn't been a player in this. Even the Commission has been sidelined to some degree, and the normal legislative and constitutional processes of the EU. And the actors that have tried to come back into the game are the domestic democratic actors, parties, parliaments, and so on. And yet they have also found that quite difficult to control, because executives have been told that they've got to act responsibly within this crisis, and that's meant that it's made it very hard for them to be responsive to the demands of their different electorates. So I think it's shown the difficulties of supranational democratic governance and the importance of developing domestic democratic governance.
You talked in your presentation about sort of the disconnect between domestic politics and the decision-making processes that go on there and the decisions that are actually being taken at the EU level, which I think was a very interesting point. Moving forward, hopefully at some point moving out of the crisis, what do you see as a sort of a potential balance between the needs of the EU to ensure some sort of stability within the Eurozone and the need to sort of respect the democratic order in the member states themselves?
I think that is the major challenge that's been revealed by this crisis. So the standard view of democracy in the EU has always been to talk about a democratic deficit in EU decision-making at the EU level. So the idea has been, well, we need to give more powers to the European Parliament to develop it further. But as one of the presentations in the conference showed, the trend of declining voter turnout after every major extension of the European Parliament's powers has continued with the crisis. The crisis, above all, must have made EU policy making salient amongst electors, and yet it didn't produce greater politicization at the European level. Instead, where there has been huge politicization of EU matters, has been in the domestic contexts. The difficulty, though, has been that people haven't felt that what they do and the views that they express in the domestic context about the EU policy making necessarily have any effect, either in controlling or developing new policies on the part of their executives. So I think that it's thinking about reconnecting domestic politics and EU politics is the major challenge for now, through making national parliaments more active and therefore parties more active, giving parties incentives for to actually politicize in the standard way that they do all domestic policies, what their EU policies should be. That's what we need. What we need is what I call the domestication and the normalization of EU politics.
2 days ago now, we had the referendum on independence in Scotland, which did end up being a no vote, but seemed to be very close and contentious to the very end. And I wonder whether this issue that we saw in the Scottish referendum of the idea of, you know, a faraway sort of even quasi-foreign rule from London, that sort of feeling that government of important issues is far away from home and not really representative of the views of the population. I wonder if it's a similar dynamic going on there within a national or state level as going on in the EU, and you know, whether there are any broader conclusions about the state of government or the state of democracy in at all levels in Europe today.
Yes, I think it is of a similar dynamic in the sense that what one needs to somehow bring together is the demand of people for communal self-rule at a level of the polity that makes sense to them, that they feel, that they identify with. And when I say that, I don't mean that in some form of cultural, ethnic nationalism. I think one of the reasons why the demand for self-rule in Scotland is so great is because Scotland has had a long and ongoing tradition of its own political institutions, and you know, it's got a separate church, a separate legal system, a separate education system, and when you have those distinct political institutions, that leads, they form a people, and they form a distinct set of values. And so what one has within the United Kingdom are precisely a unity of different polities that are already structured, which have framed political identities. And so the way in which the United Kingdom has to work is in a way which is sensitive to producing British policies which reflect their interdependence, whilst at the same time giving room to the self-government of its constituent polities. And that's quite difficult because they're very, very different groups, and you've got something like 85% of the population in one of them, England. Within the EU, it's a similar thing, though far less well developed at the EU level than the United Kingdom is at the British level. So you have the formation in this respect of a functional union, the EU, which exists to deal with the issues of interdependence between the member states. But I think what's happened, particularly since Maastricht, is that for many people, the EU has taken on a sort of life of its own, rather than being something which is seen as serving the interests of its constituent parts. And I don't mean that when I say serving the interests, I don't mean that in a narrow, self-interested way. I mean in a way which develops mutual respect and equity between its constituent parts, but nonetheless sees as its key function the empowerment of those constituent parts, as it enables them to coexist and develop as self-governing units with their own distinct political cultures. Now, I think that vision, which has been the great success of the EU, the great success of enlargement, of letting ever more countries come into the EU so that they too can stabilize as self-governing democracies. That's been the fantastic success. That's been jeopardized by a vision of the EU as becoming some form of centralized, federal, democratic structure of its own, which of course those involved in it are naturally drawn to think. You just get socialized by the institutions in which you're in. But it's not the view held by the majority of populations. And so the reconnection that's needed lies there. And likewise, I think in the UK, Britain may have to reinvent itself as a union which exists to support its constituent parts, rather than being somehow beyond them, dictating them. That's what devolution is bringing. But at the same time, I think that the Scots, the Welsh, the Irish, and indeed the English have to learn that there's no such thing as purely English policies, purely Scottish policies. All of those policies are at the same time as being English policies or Scottish policies are also British policies. So that's the mentality that has to develop both within the United Kingdom and within the EU. And a bottom-up way of doing it, I think, is the way to go.
Thank you very much for joining me today, Dr. Bellamy.